just so you know.
I think we're good now.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Diverseability, another episode. And today we have two very special guests with us today. And if they both would like to introduce themselves, now is the time.
I'm going to start. Okay, so I'm Dr. Catherine Jacquet. I'm a professor of history and women's gender and sexuality studies at Louisiana State University.
And I am Dr. Liam Lair, he, him pronouns. She's a she, her pronouns. I am associate professor of women's and gender studies at Westchester University. And we're excited to be in conversation with you today, Emma.
Awesome. And if you guys don't know who I am, my name is Emma Billingsley. I use she, they pronouns, and I am the host of this here show. Okay, so this topic that we are talking about for you all today is a little bit touchy, and I know it can be hard for people to talk about it sometimes, but it's also extremely important to talk about. And what this topic is, it is the most recent decision on Roe v. Wade. Unfortunately, what the Supreme Court decided to do a few weeks ago was overturn Roe v. Wade. And what Roe v. Wade did was give women a right to have access to a safe and healthy abortion. And now, unfortunately, in so many states already, they basically don't have that. Right. And we just want to talk to you all about that and give a brief history. And I'm going to be learning some information myself from this as well, because it's important to know how we got here and important to know why we should support women and people of the LGBTQ community in their fights to get access to safe and healthy abortions. Mm-hmm. So right into the questions here. What does this decision mean for everybody in the United States?
Right. Well, it's a great question to start with. And I think the most sort of obvious answer is that immediately, pregnant people are not guaranteed access to an abortion depending on which state they live in, right? Like, as you said, Roe v. Wade provided for freedom and liberty as mandated by the federal courts, that people had at least some access to abortion. But now if you live in a state where there are abortion bans, you can be criminalized, you can be surveilled, you do not have access at all. And the way the map works, if you look at a map of the US, a lot of those red states are concentrated in the South and the Southeast, a little bit in the Midwest. And so right now, you can travel to another state to access an abortion if you have the funds and the means to do so. But the really difficult thing is if you are in the middle of all those group of red states, if you live in Louisiana, if you live in Mississippi, you're traveling. If you're driving, it's at least 15-hour drive. You have to be able to fly. So this most acutely affects and impacts the folks that have always been vulnerable, right? So poor folks, folks with disabilities, folks that live at sort of these intersections of being marginalized by the systems that are in place. So there are folks for whom they've always had a difficulty accessing abortion because of funds, because of state regulations, and we can get into that in a little bit. But most immediately, the folks in those states that are predominantly Republican red states do not have access to abortion. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, Louisiana right now, you can still access an abortion, but that will be overturned quickly. And then the closest states for Louisianans is either New Mexico or Illinois, and that's not close at all. So there's that. But also this decision, the Dobbs decision, is going to create major hardships for people who do want to have children, who do want to get pregnant. People who, have an ectopic pregnancy now. An ectopic pregnancy is when the sperm and the egg do not attach inside the uterus. They attach in the fallopian tubes or outside of the fallopian tubes. It's extremely dangerous.
It's not a viable pregnancy.
It's not a viable pregnancy. And so we've already started seeing stories in the news, right? Is that people, and the treatment for an ectopic pregnancy is an abortion. But people aren't going to be able to access that until the pregnant person is severely ill, like borderline on their deathbed. That makes no sense. We shouldn't have to wait till somebody is severely harmed. Folks who lose their pregnancy along the way, where the fetus not viable for other reasons, where the fetus has died, the treatment for that, again, is an abortion, right? And so we've heard news stories of people who, these are wanted children, wanted pregnancies, I should say, and they have to carry a dead fetus because they cannot get the treatment that they need. So, you know, as Liam was saying, both those who want to have an abortion because it was an unwanted pregnancy, but also this is going to have a really, really dramatic impact on people who do want pregnancies when that pregnancy goes wrong.
Right. And, you know, I feel like that is a lot of information. I feel like people still don't quite understand that. Like an ectopic pregnancy, especially, that is very dangerous. It'd be very dangerous to the mother.
Yeah.
And, you know, people who say, oh, we're pro-life, that's not what pro-life means. That is not being truly pro-life, because they're not being pro-life to the alive mother right there. They're just like,
Well, I think this decision makes very clear that these folks, as you say, are not pro-life, they're pro-birth. Because if they were pro-life, right, they would be pro-family autonomy, pro-autonomy and self-determination for all pregnant people. They would be anti-death penalty. They would be pro-prison abolition, right? If we think about all the ways we limit and curtail life, we don't provide social services. We don't provide paternal and maternal, like parental leave for work. There's all these ways that we don't provide for families and life. So this makes it very clear that these folks are very pro-birth and nothing else.
And also, you know, you think about how this is going to impact people who are sexually assaulted, victims of incest, you know, all these these abortion bans don't have it. Many of them don't have exceptions for people who have been sexually assaulted or victims of incest. And like, how pro-life is that when you're forcing somebody to carry a pregnancy as the result of that kind of harm?
Right. You know, it definitely is not pro-life at all. And I guess my next question is, how did we get here? How did we get to this point of, you know, Roe v. Wade being overturned after all this time of it, after all these decades of Roe v. Wade being into law? How did we get to here in 2022? How do we get to a place where it feels like we're going backwards?
Yeah, sorry about my coughing. This is actually not a surprise at all. You know, in the late 1970s, you see the rise of the religious right, and they organized very, very effectively at the local level, and they got involved in national politics. So you really see this merging of religion and politics. This is very new in the 1970s. And essentially the religious right then also proceeds to take over the Republican Party. This is how Reagan wins in 1980. So the right creates a very compelling narrative about the fetus, about the rights of the fetus, creates this idea of the fetus as a person. This did not exist prior to the 1970s. And they organize very, very effective. So that you have that very compelling narrative. They organize very effectively at the local level, and they work their way up. So they're not just targeting federal. I mean, they're really targeting at the most local level, municipal elections, you know, things that we don't think are that important. And they very, very smartly organized and made their way up through the system. So they also created narratives about post-abortion. They have, like, I don't really know what they call it, but like depression or different kinds of syndromes, all these things that aren't actually medically true, but they spun these stories and made them believable, and people bought into it. So that's part of the story.
Well, and I think there's also this racial component of the religious right really advocating for segregated schools, for private religious schools to not be taxed, and they were losing those fights. And so they were looking for something that was really palatable to bring together communities, and this abortion issue was the issue. But again, they had a really rocky start, because again, if you are pro-life, right, there's a large group of Catholics that were really pro-life in the 1970s, but again, they were also anti-war. They were, in many ways, other than the abortion issue, folks that we would define as very liberal or progressive today. So the religious right also had to sort of detach this sort of pro-life, sort of anti-choice movement from these other politics. But Kat's absolutely right? At the state legislatures, they were there, where the Democrats and folks that were sort of more left were focusing on sort of federal policies. So the Republican right, the new religious right, did that very well. But the other thing they did is they focused on the courts, and in particular, creating a pipeline of lawyers and judges to fill the Supreme Court. And they were playing a long game, and that's where we are today, right? The conservatives thought that Casey v. Planned Parenthood, which was a case from the 90s, was going to be the one that overturned Roe v. Wade, but they didn't have the majority yet on the Supreme Court. But as soon as Trump was elected, they gave him a list. And that's how we got Kavanaugh, Comey Barrett, the other dudes, of course. Anyway, that's how we ended up here.
Right. And it definitely, at first I was definitely surprised by this decision, but now after like listening to like so many things about it, there were literally predictions. Like I saw a TED talk like a few weeks ago that basically said Roe v. Wade is going to be over within the year. And 6 months ago, it was 6 months ago that it was posted, and I was just like, I didn't realize that this was here. I didn't realize all these predictions were being made, because I feel like we've been so focused on other things, such as, not to put the elephant in the room, but Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. So focused on, everybody was so focused on that, while they were secretly overturning Roe v. Wade. It's like they're putting all these like famous trials and stuff. Like there's all these distractions that really distracts us from what.
And it wasn't a secret, like people knew, Roe v. Wade has been under attack ever since it passed, starting in the 70s, the Hyde Amendment, and then all the restrictions that were passed at the state level ever since. In Louisiana, until recently, we had there's only 3 places in Louisiana where you can get an abortion. I mean, part of the problem has been this restriction to access.
Right.
South Dakota, there's 1 clinic.
Right.
So.
And part of that was how Roe was argued, but for the time it was really innovative, right? That it was, again, based on the 14th Amendment, which is really important. And that's where Alito, sort of the author of the majority opinion, Clarence Thomas, like the history that they talk about in the Dobbs decision, and the majority opinion is wholly wrong, right?
Completely incorrect.
It is not based in any historical reality of what the 13th and the 14th Amendment mean in terms of, again, autonomy, liberty, freedom to define your family, to define how you live your life, to be free of coercion and forced pregnancies. And they're really concerned not about our current historical moment. They're concerned with, what would the public have said in the late 1800s, which isn't relevant.
And they get that wrong too. I mean, all of Alito's history, and this has been, the American Historical Association, the Organization of American Historians were the 2 biggest international organizations of professional historians, have both, they wrote an amicus for Dobbs, and they came out with a statement after Dobbs. But like the history is literally incorrect. Like the way Alito spins the history of abortion, the criminalization of abortion, and American beliefs about abortion is literally incorrect. So it's bad history.
And Thomas is also incorrect. He talks about abortion being a sort of a eugenic movement that harms the Black community, but abortion has never been something that's harmed the Black community, right? Sterilization has been what's harmed the Black community. Sterilization is what's harmed Indigenous communities, folks with disabilities. Like it's all about controlling pregnant people's bodies. And abortion hands control back, access to it, hands it back to the folks that, again, are most vulnerable. But as Kat was pointing out, Roe is never guaranteed fair access, right? Very quickly after Roe was decided, they decided that federal funds could not help cover abortion. So folks who didn't
That
have
was the
money,
Hyde Amendment.
that's the Hyde Amendment, couldn't pay, like if you couldn't afford it, you couldn't access one.
Yeah, you couldn't use Medicare.
But again, this sort of organizing on the religious right at the state level to set all these limits have really impacted who can actually access it.
Or Medicaid, right? Medicaid.
Anyway,
yes.
that was a long answer. Yeah.
We can keep talking history, but let's move on.
Yeah. Well, speaking of politicians,
Yes.
do you think that there's anything politicians could have done more to prevent this from happening?
Well, I think so. We often think about the left, right? And what could the left have done? And I think most folks who are Democrats at this point are way more centrist than they ever used to have been. Like, I think the entire political spectrum has shifted to the right. I think in some ways, if we had focused on the state level, maybe, I think if we had organized differently, but ultimately, I think I take the view of we need to be listening to the folks that are doing the organizing, right? Black feminists who have been organizing for not abortion rights or reproductive rights, but reproductive justice, this much more holistic understanding of justice. And I think if our political leaders emerge from those groups, or if they listen to those groups, the political landscape would look really different, because I think all of the laws and the policies, we could have all the laws and policies. And I think that that's important, like Roe v. Wade being overturned has already impacted people's lives, right? In really devastating ways. But there's also lots of laws and policies that will never help the folks that are the most marginalized, right? That's literally why we have critical race theory, right? Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, all of these folks were thinking about, we have these laws that are supposedly supposed to protect us, but why does racism persist in the law? Why does sexism persist in the law? And so how do we think about how the laws continue to fail us? So sure, I'm sure there's things that could have happened differently, but I think at the core, thinking about a more justice-oriented approach to reproductive autonomy rather than just thinking about abortion.
Also, I mean, let's take a page out of the religious rights playbook. I mean, look how they organize, look how effective this is a 40-year plan that's come to fruition.
Mm-hmm.
And they did it very, very, in such a smart way. Again, at the local level, little by little, and you work your way up. I mean, it was the long game.
Mm-hmm.
So
right.
We can learn from them,
mm-hmm.
right?
And I think grounding some arguments and that's where there is democratic power. The Congress could pass legislation ensuring access to abortion. Are they going to do that? No, right?
Well, because there's too many Republicans that won't let it go through.
And so again, sort of and the voting, voting is important. It's not the only thing though. So supporting abortion funds, getting connected to local organizations that are doing this work. Again, thinking more holistically about family autonomy, about medical care, about universal health care, about not just thinking about this as a women's issue, but thinking about this as a disability justice issue, as a racial justice issue, as a class justice issue. I think coalitional politics, which are way harder than single issue politics, which is where the right was so successful. And I think part of the reason the fight on the other side is much more difficult is because you have to think coalitionally and how to impact people's lives tomorrow, right?
Right. There's so many things that, go into it, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like, like you said, we're just focused on abortion, but we have to think about it, like you said, holistically. Like you have to think about it as more than just that. You have to think about it as universal health care. When's that going to happen?
Never.
Right. Yeah. Or again, not just pro-birth, but okay, so you want people to have kids, and if everyone survives that, where are you helping people pay for diapers? Are you giving them we're the only sort of wealthy country that doesn't again have paternal leave or parental leave, that doesn't have incredible support for daycare,
the government doesn't subsidize daycare. My cousin in Canada pays $5 a day, if that, for daycare. Here people have to take a second job to subsidize daycare,
right?
So there there's no, nothing is put in place to support these new policies that are requiring people to have babies. It's like, okay, well, if you're going to require people to have babies, then as Liam was saying, then you have to be able to support them in having those babies.
And
that's not the country we have.
And I think to the budget piece, if you're pro-life, you also have to be really critical of the police, right? And this, again, is a Black feminist perspective about how police violence is a reproductive justice issue. That if parents in the Black community cannot raise their children without fear of them experiencing violence and dying at a young age at the hands of police, that's a reproductive justice issue. So rerouting funds away from police, away from these sort of militarized ways we surveil people, you're not pro-life, right? Like, you're pro-birth. So again, it's a really broad, I think, perspective that we need to take.
Honestly, I gotta say the pro-choice people are way more pro-life than any of these clowns claim to be pro-life.
Right.
Honestly, it's almost like we should like take back that term, because we're actually the ones who say, less, we need to have welfare, we need to have universal health care, we need to stop gun violence and stop the sales of, you know, semi-automatic weapons. I mean, we're the ones who are actually invested in life and sustaining life, honestly.
All right. Yeah. It's definitely like this has really been eye-opening, you know, just thinking about it like in a different way. You know, sometimes I just focus on one issue or another, but I don't think about the intersectionality of everything, which is a term I learned from you.
Yeah, shout out to Kimberly Crenshaw, right? Like one of the founders of critical race theory, needing a lens of intersectionality to sort of see how these all these things come together. Right?
Listen to Black women, I'm telling you. And that was, you know, to answer your question of what should politicians, you know, have been doing. Well, they should have been listening, and I'm talking about the white politicians.
Black feminists.
They should have been listening to Black feminists and women of color.
Definitely. So my next question has to do with like kind of like also the pursuing gun violence in America. And I'm wondering, do you think that guns have more rights than women and the LGBTQ community and just people who are marginalized do in America?
Well, they're certainly much more protected. I mean, guns are, right? I mean, it really says a lot about our country and our country's priorities when you see the power of the gun lobby, how very little attention is paid to gun violence. I mean, like attention is paid and so like, oh, it's in the media, it's, you know, the shocking, quote unquote, shocking, another mass shooting. It's like, it's not a shock anymore, right? We have all this evidence that points to like an obvious answer, right? Like we should not have semi-automatic and militarized weapons in the hands of civilians. We just shouldn't. We don't need them. They shouldn't be in, you know.
You don't need them for hunting.
But despite all that evidence, you have the gun lobby, which has the money, which controls the politicians. You know, I mean, the CDC has literally been unable, and I need to check it. You know, I still think like the gun lobby stopped them from conducting research on gun violence, on the impact of gun violence on Americans. Like, it's a major public health issue. It has been for over 20 years. And yet there hasn't been the ability to do that research because the gun lobby has stopped it. I mean, it's like right in front of our eyes, like just put two and two together. We see very clearly what's going on here. So yeah, I mean, in a way, you know, the right to own guns, to bear arms, to murder people, is a higher priority in this country than women's access to safe and healthy medical procedures. That's it.
And again, I know I keep saying this and I feel like a broken record, but this contradiction or this paradox of folks that say that they're pro-life, right? And then vote to expand access to assault weapons.
Make it make sense.
And this is part of the reason I think some of these conversations are so hard, because how do you respond to absurdity, right? Like if there is no logic, how do you respond? And I think that's part of the difficulty of the conversation sometimes, when we just take things at face value when people say they're pro-life, but then you look at the rest of the things that they're doing, and it doesn't make any sense. To the point where, yeah, I think guns, they're more protected. And I think it's also interesting when people talk about the issue of abortion, we talk about the life of the unborn child and the fetus, and believe what you want. But what's so interesting to me, most of those conversations you hear, at no point is there any acknowledgement that that fetus is in a person, right? A pregnant person exists. Many times that person might identify as a woman, not always, but that person is never part of that conversation.
And the impact on that person's life, and the impact of, the person who's carrying the pregnancy.
Yeah.
There's no conversation about what does this mean, like, about that person and their rights. There's such an obsession on the quote unquote rights of the fetus, which again is a very new historical concept of the past 40 years, that literally this idea did not exist 50 years ago.
Yeah. And then you're ending up with compelled pregnancies, people at risk from abuse from their partners. And again, there's really long histories of this. Dorothy Roberts is a brilliant scholar. One of her first books is called Killing the Black Body. She's now talking about family policing systems, the child welfare system, which has not very much interest in children's welfare. But she talks a lot about that and sort of the way Black women in particular, women of color, pregnant people of color historically have not been protected, have been exploited in ways that, guns have more protections.
Yeah. And yeah, it's just very frustrating that, like, in 2022, we just haven't really gotten to a place where where the gun violence has like lessened, or where
It's gotten worse.
Right.
it's gotten worse, and people in the Black community, they're getting shot left and right, and it's quite ridiculous how they can just be trends on Twitter.
Yeah. And I think the common ground between these two issues, between sort of reproductive justice, abortion, police violence, is that at the center, and I think when we talk about our system being broken, right? And often I say it's not actually broken, it's working exactly as it was designed to work. Because with both of these issues, whose interest is being protected? White men's, right? And this is not to demonize white men as individuals, but if we think about masculinity and patriarchy and white supremacy, it's those interests that are being protected time and again. So with the gun rights issue, with reproductive justice, with really any sort of legal issue, we always have to think about, who is this really protecting, and who's at the center, and who's making these decisions. And it becomes very clear.
Also, I think this idea of like, it's 2020, how can this be happening? Or I guess it's 2022 now, but because I think it's rooted in this idea, this false narrative, this false progress narrative. Like we tell ourselves the country, or like there's this kind of myth, right? This narrative, the country keeps getting better and better and better. But it's, and if we didn't actually think that or believe that, then it wouldn't be a shock that in 2022, this is what we're, which is what the world looks like. Because that is a false narrative, this idea of like the country is just on a upward trajectory. It's not, it never has been. History is much more complicated and complex than that. And and I
think that's one of the really difficult things. And I know we're going to get to this question about how we protest and fight this decision, and there's lots of things we can do. And I'm always going to say vote, especially at the local level. But I think that's one of the things, again, that the religious right has done very well over the past 3 or 4 decades, is getting people into gubernatorial positions in different states where they have then redrawn voting districts, and they've really set themselves up to remain in power because of how the Voting Rights Act has been gutted at the federal level, the way districts have been redrawn, that we have a very long road ahead of us. And I think voting is very important, but to really think about and be strategic about or recognize how we are sort of starting at a disadvantage, at least in terms of the democratic sort of quote unquote process that's supposed to be like really fair. It's not, right?
It's not
Are there things we can do that are radical and transformative right now, today, tomorrow? Absolutely. But I think that's, again, another thing that the Republicans, particularly the religious right, has done very well.
Yeah, the gerrymandering has been very effective. So like in Louisiana, for example, we have 5 districts. 4 of those are majority white. Meanwhile, our population is 30% Black.
Yeah.
It's not fair. It's just plain,
It's not representative.
clearly not fair. It's not representative. So, but yeah, which is not to say don't vote. Voting is really important. Again, that's how the religious right made,
We
they
have to
voted their
support that.
people in, and
We can
here
vote
we
them out.
are. We can vote them out, right? But again, there's been so many attacks on voting. It's getting increasingly more difficult. And mind you, every single attack on voting rights is always coming from the Republican Party. That is a fact. So you can see all the changes to voting laws, that's all coming from Republicans, and all of those laws, restrict access to the vote. So that's just a fact. It's the Republican Party who does not actually want a truly representative Democratic voting population. And that is like an absolute fact. It's not hyperbole.
Right. Now, I will, for everybody to know, this has been a really great conversation. We do only have about 5 minutes left, but my last question to you guys is, how can we protest and just fight this decision? This is my favorite question.
Love it. Abortion funds, give to your local abortion funds. I can send you, if you want to attach it underneath the YouTube video, some Instagram folks you can follow that will keep you updated. Stay up to date on sort of what's happening, what's coming down. Think more broadly beyond abortion. Again, sort of thinking about reproductive justice, thinking about how to support families, how to support parents, how to support the ways all of these issues come together, and just think coalitionally, right? Follow Black feminists, listen to Black feminists, jump in.
I would say, again, organize at the local level, like these smaller elections that nobody pays attention to and don't think are important, like school board elections are critically important. I mean, those are the people who are going to be determining what people are learning in school. Are people learning to critically think? What history are they being taught, right? Those municipal elections, like all those local elections really, really, really matter. And people need to pay attention to those. And also, this is a very difficult time. A lot of us are very, very demoralized, but we have to, as difficult as it is, you have to keep faith and you have to keep hope that we can make change, right? If people in the 1960s who are organizing against racism, against the war, against nuclear weapons, right? If all those people were like, oh, it's never going to change, we give up. Imagine where we would be now. And so I'm just going to quote the great and amazing Black feminist Angela Davis, who says, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time.
I love that quote.
It's true.
That's true. Well, I will have to say thank you both for joining me today and letting me ask you guys a few questions. I definitely learned a lot. I hope the viewers learn a lot too. I will definitely be blasting this episode once it's out.
Cool.
And definitely give me those links to those Instagram pages and to different places.
Awesome. Emma, thank you so much for this opportunity. Thanks for the great questions. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
All right. Thank you. Stop recording.